腕立て伏せ100回上体起こし100回スクワット100回そしてランニング10キロこれを毎日やる
Ryo has decided enough is enough. If he is going to be the S-tier hero Japan needs, he needs to train his body. After a year and a half of training, he may not have become bald, but can I beat Ishin with a single punch? At first when I talked about this challenge to my brother, he said it's definitely impossible, and I agreed with him at first. But I mean, how funny would it be if it was actually possible, right? Rules for this challenge are as follows. If I throw a single punch, it must kill an enemy or I must restart. I can only use punches to attack, meaning if I kick or shoulder tackle, I have to restart. There are a couple of exceptions to this rule. First of all, these armored enemies, just because you do actually have to break their armor in order to start dealing health damage. I will be allowed to punch them twice, but both of these punches need to either break their armor or kill them. Also with bosses, they do have this weird health cap that prevents them from taking too much damage before entering their next phase. Each punch, however, must at least reach this cap, or I fail. Tutorial sections and parts that force you to use a weapon don't count. Spliced runs are allowed, meaning if I failed, I could just speed through to whichever section I failed at and continue to attempt the challenge from there. Hey, I just wanted to see if it was possible, alright? Lastly, switching styles was allowed, as long as I did not attack them, which allowed me to use trooper abilities if needed. Basically, how troopers work is they can be assigned as either a trooper or a corporal, and what the corporal does, it gives a passive bonus based on whichever you choose, and with all of the troopers, including the corporal, they can also be activated in order to give a temporary or immediate buff or bonus, or they can heal you, etc. I used this guy as my corporal since he gave me passive damage at the beginning, but I later found out that this guy was actually a better choice. I also had a bunch of these guys as my troopers, which, when active, gave me a bunch more brawler damage. I'll be playing on New Game Plus with my upgraded abilities and all of my equipment with Fierce Battle Seals after an abundance of grinding, which shall not be talked about. See my last video. I'll also be putting up a kill count and a punch count. Spoiler warning also. Game started in Legend since I didn't actually have Ishin, and it seemed that the difficulty changes didn't actually make a difference to the health of bosses, which honestly is where it mattered the most. After rushing through the first few tutorial sections, I encountered my first real battle, Nishiki. This is where that issue with the boss damage caps actually started to show. If I tried to tiger drop him, it would always leave him with a sliver of health. I also found useful all these pill bugs, which if I ate all of them, it would kill me far quicker than letting the enemies kill me naturally. Moving on, I was actually pretty pleased with how overpowered I was by this point, but the next section would leave me with a few slight issues. Long dungeon sections. Again, not a huge issue since I could just start from certain segments if I failed, because once again I could splice the run. But I kept gaining heat, and that forced me to use that one counter sword heat action. To fix this, I switched to swordsman, stood there menacingly with my technique attack, and just didn't let go. I wouldn't deal any damage to enemies, but I would still be able to just get rid of all of my heat. Then there was another issue. This effing armored guy. No matter how much damage I dealt to him, with my tiger drop, it would always take just a quarter of his armor. A second hit would always drop him to half armor, and a third drop would completely deplete his armor. I actually only found out much later that this was consistent with all armored enemies. All of them have damage caps, and if they have armor, their armor cannot be broken in fewer than 3 hits. I began experimenting and then I figured something out. Tiger Drop has a hitbox. It's not huge, but it's enough to be able to hit multiple enemies at once. As long as they were close enough, I could actually kill a regular enemy and also hit this armored dude at the same time. Remember guys, 1 punch and 1 kill. Collateral damage is definitely not my fault, okay? Doing this, I also somehow managed to do the first Nishiki fight in 1 hit as well. I did a bit of backtracking and I tiger dropped him and one of his goons simultaneously. Now, after I managed to do that, the goon flew back and the damage from that actually managed to finish the job. Anyway, after a bit of trial and error, I actually eventually got through the rest of the dungeon. By the end, I one-shot Jack-O-Lantern Panic and let him run away. Chapter 2 started, and it was mostly just a bunch of runarounds. Nothing too special, but this part was mandatory to use wooden swords, so not including that in the counter. A few other fights later, I got to the Saigo fight, which I was very eager to see how strong I was, and I was not disappointed. After almost cleaving his skull with a single punch, we got together and engaged in some consensual CBT, since otherwise this QuickTime event would cause damage to him that I was not allowed to deal. And another thing, certain QuickTime events I was not allowed to actually succeed in, otherwise it might damage the opponent through means other than just punches. Anyway, managed to get to his damage cap and I did it in 2 hits no problem. Next up was the Nishiki fight, and honestly he was pretty easy. I dispatched him and his goons pretty easily and got to his damage cap each punch with no real problems. Chapter 3 there were literally only 2 fights, the Seijima fight and the Man in White. Seijima I beat his first stage with 1 punch, but of course the boss damage cap prevented one-shotting, so it took 2 punches total. The Man in White was exactly the same, and that was the end of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 was really easy until the very end. There was actually a long segment that had me and Date-san fighting through a massive horde of enemies. Now he did very little damage, but it was enough to weaken a lot of the enemies and allow me to deal a finishing blow with a single punch. I could have utilized him a lot more to lower my punch count, but god, it would have taken a while. The Komaki evade and strike actually helped me to deal with the gunmen who had less health in comparison to the regular enemies and would sometimes allow me to one-shot them. Still counts as a punch as long as it's the right type of dodge. I did find out much later that I could actually just whiff some of my punches in a combo and just land the finishing blow to deal a bunch more damage if needed, but hey, it is what it is and I still got through this no problem. Shout out to Date-san who really helped me in this section.
Why won't you die? No, God!
Chapter 5 consisted of 2 boss fights. First was this guy who surprisingly gave me a bit of trouble since his attacks were super delayed and it threw off my timing. That being said, he actually didn't have a health cap, so for some reason I was able to one-shot him. The second was the Nishiki fight. I started with the people outside, which I had friends with me, so they just weakened them significantly and I dealt the final blow to him. But then came the boss fight itself. I threw my first Tiger Drop and... shit.